Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from OnlinePhotographyTraining.com. Welcome to my video series, Mastering Lightroom Classic CC. In this video, we're going to take a look at the tone curve that's found in the Develop module of Lightroom Classic CC. Now, over here on the right panel of the Develop module, the tone curve is the second tab down from the top. If you don't see it, right-click on any of the existing tabs and make sure that the tone curve has a check mark next to it. If it doesn't have a check mark, it disappears. So just right-click and click on it and you'll have that check mark, and then you could open it up. Lightroom actually has two tone curves. What we're looking at now, and the default curve when you open the tone curve for the first time, is the point curve. If you look over here at the bottom, there's a little box in the lower right hand corner. If you click on that, you're opening up the other curve, which is called the region curve. They pretty much do the same thing. It's just applied a little differently, or it allows you to work with the curve slightly differently. And many people find the region curve, this is the curve we're looking at right now, a little bit easier to use. And I'll use this to explain what the tone curve actually does. All the tone curve does is it allows you to adjust the shadows, midtones, and or highlights independently of one another, either lighter or darker. So you could make the shadows lighter or darker, the midtones lighter or darker, or even the highlights lighter or darker, and it's all done on the curve. And the way the curve is laid out, you'll see this diagonal line. Over here on the y-axis, when you're low on the axis, you're darker. As you move up, it gets brighter. And then on the x-axis, this is the actual parts of the image, with the darkest tones being on the far left and the lightest tones, or the brightest highlights, being on the far right, and of course the midtones right in the middle. And the way to illustrate this is with the region curve. I could just mouse over any of the sliders, and if I mouse over the highlight slider, you'll see on the curve itself this part gets affected. So I'm mousing over the highlights, and you'll see that if you move your highlight slider, if I move it to the right, I'm making the highlights brighter. And as you look at the image, you'll see the sky, which is a highlight, is getting brighter. And you'll also see the corresponding part of that diagonal line is being pushed up, because remember the y-axis, as you go up, you're going to get brighter. As you go down, you're going to get darker. So we're moving highlights up. Similarly, if I take that highlight slider and move it to the left, I'm making the highlights darker, and I'm pulling that region of this curve lower. So I'm pulling them towards shadows. So I'm making the highlights darker. To reset the slider, just double click on the name highlights and you'll reset it right in the middle. Now if I hover over lights, you could see that a larger part of the curve gets affected with lights. We're actually doing much of the midtones and the highlights. So if I move this to the right, I'm affecting more pixels in the image. You can see more of the image is getting bright because we're affecting the midtones. And similarly, if I move it to the left, more of the image will be getting dark. And to reset it, double click on it. If I hover over or mouse over the darks, you could see that's a very large section. All the shadows are going to be affected, and most of the midtones are going to be affected. So if I move this to the right, I'm going to make the majority of the image brighter. And if I move it to the left, I'm making a majority of the image darker. And I could double click it and reset it. And finally, if I mouse over the shadows, you can see a smaller part of the curve is affected. It's in the lower left-hand corner. That is where the shadows reside. And similarly, if I move it to the right, I'll be making the shadows brighter, and move it to the left, I'll be making the shadows darker. So as I mentioned, this is the region curve, and a lot of people prefer to use this. You'll also notice that going across the bottom of the curve when you're in the region curve are these three sliders. This slider, as I move it to the right, you're kind of affecting where the highlights slider and the light slider will affect. Meaning if I move it all the way I can to the right, which is at 90, and then I start moving this highlight slider to the right, you could see that this very kind of limited part of the curve will be adjusted. On the other hand, if I take it and move it more towards the left, more towards midtones, a larger part of the curve gets affected. So we're affecting more of the highlights when we readjust or adjust this far right hand slider. It'll affect more of the highlights. By default, they're kind of equidistant from each other. And similarly, for the shadows, you'll notice at its default location, if I go down here on shadows and I hover or mouse over the shadow slider, you'll see how much of the shadows get affected. But if I move this to the left, I'm going to restrict it, as you can see, to a smaller area. And then less of the image will be affected. And conversely, if I move it to the right, more towards the midtones, more of the image gets affected. So that's how you could affect more or less of the highlights and shadows by moving this far right slider for the highlights and this far left slider for the shadows. Now this middle slider is the midtones, and that will gauge how much of the midtones get affected when you either move any of the four sliders, but more so the lights and darks. So if I move it more to the left, well, first let's leave it at its default position. And if I hover over, let's say, the lights, you can see how much of the lights are affected. And as it approaches the middle, it starts to diminish. If I move it, though, to the left and then hover over the lights, you could see that it's affecting more. It's starting to get into the shadows a little bit. So this slider will affect more of the shadows than it would if this midtone slider was at its default position. Similarly, if I moved it to the right, then the lights will be more restricted, not as much will be affected, but the dark slider will affect more. So it's kind of a trade-off. You're restricting one while enhancing or increasing the effect of the other, meaning lights opposing darks, if that made sense. So that's where you could kind of better affect specific parts or regions of the tone curve itself by moving these three sliders. But with that said, many of us think the point curve is more effective at doing that. And to get to the point curve, again, you would just click on this little square over here, and now we have the point curve, and you'll see the sliders are gone. We actually will go on the curve itself and move it around. So if I want to move shadows brighter, I would go towards the left side of the curve. On the x-axis, the left side of the curve controls more of the darker tones in the image. And if I want to make them brighter, I would just put a point on it by clicking on it and then push up. And you would be able then to make those parts of the curve brighter. But you'll see it kind of moves the whole curve in kind of a parabolic move, which may not be desirable. So what you could do is go click here and go to linear. That'll get rid of that point. Then you'll want to put an anchor point down. So you can put an anchor point down right in the middle at midtones, and then come down here and then push it up, and you could see it affects it a little more restrictively, so it's not affecting as many of the other tones. Often you'll want to put more than one point down. So we'll go back to linear, and you might want to put one at midtones, and then one further down into the darker midtones, and then come down here in the shadows and push those up. And you can see how it's just affecting the shadows. And if I pull it down, I'll be making the darker shadows darker. If I move it up, the lighter shadows lighter. So we could really adjust the tones of a very specific part of the image, or a tonal range of the image, with the point curve. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to get these points off. With Photoshop, and those of you that are familiar with it as I'm messing up my image, you could just pull those points right off. And with Lightroom, there isn't an easy way except to right click right on it, on the point, and then delete control point, and then right click, delete control point, or you would just go to this drop down and go back to linear, and that will reset your curve back to this diagonal line. Now you may have noticed in this drop down there's a couple presets. One is medium contrast. If you just want to add a bit of contrast to your image, you could do it here, and you could see it does what is called an S curve. So it pushes the highlights up, makes the highlights a little brighter, but it pulls the shadows down a little bit, makes those a little darker. So that's a classic S curve. And if you want to do it even stronger, a little more contrast, go to strong contrast. You could see it just makes the S a little more pronounced. And again, you could reset it by going back to linear. This drop down is also available in the region curve. So you could add contrast here as well if you'd like to. Now, let's reset that. Let's go back to the point curve. You can do a specific curve you like. Let's say there's a curve you always do. And let's say I tend to make my highlights a little brighter. And I make my shadows, just for the sake of argument, shadows a little brighter too. And I use this a lot. Well, it says custom down here now. So you can save that as a preset if you'd like by clicking save and then giving it a name, and it will save it as a preset as far as the tone curve is concerned. So I could just save it as an, I don't know, test, we'll call it, because it's a test. And we'll save. And now it'll always be there, as you could see. So we'll go back to linear, and then there it is, test. So we have that there. If you find you're using the same type of tone curve all the time, and it's not one of those two that are already there, medium contrast and or strong contrast. Now, there is something that Lightroom calls a targeted adjustment. Now we reset our curve, and you may notice right here there's this little kind of donut, and if I hover over it, we get a couple arrows or triangles, one above and one below. If I click on it, my cursor turns into that, and you can see I have like a bullseye, and then I have that little donut with those two triangles. What that allows you to do is to pinpoint a specific part of your image that you want to make either lighter or darker. And as you can see, as I move my cursor around, look at the curve, and you'll see a point is moving around. So as I go to a darker tone, that point is really far down in the left-hand corner. And as I go to a brighter tone, it's more up in the upper right-hand corner. So I could come in here, and if I want to make the blue sky darker, I could get this tool, as I just did by clicking on it. Then with my mouse button, I'm going to click with the left button and then drag my mouse down. Now you won't be able to see it happening because when I click with the left mouse button, the cursor disappears. But now I'm starting to drag down my mouse, and you could see how it put a point over here and pulled it down, so it's making the sky darker. But in this case, it's since this image is really mostly midtones, it's tending to affect everything. But that is a way you could use this specific tool to affect parts of your image. So now if I want to come in here and make the greens a little brighter, I could go up there. So I have these kind of weird points on the curve. So that's called a targeted adjustment. When you're done, you could do it as many times as you want. You can see I have 2 points now. Let's say I want to put a point there and make that a little darker, I don't know, or lighter maybe. So we have 3. I did it 3 times. I have 3 points on the curve. And if you like it, great. If not, just go to this point curve drop down and go back to linear, or just right click on each of the points and delete the control point, or you'll notice it also said flatten curve. That's another way of just resetting the whole thing. So we have that reset. Now, with that said, there's still more you could do with the point curve, and actually, well, with the point curve mainly. Let's talk about this first. You'll see right here it has channel, and everything we've been doing has been affecting all 3 color channels, the red, the green, and the blue. You can affect just one color channel at a time if you prefer. Use this drop down, and we go to red. Now, any red tones in the image will be affected by the curve, and the red tones only. So we could go to like here, and if I want to make the darker red tones brighter, click there and the darker red tones get brighter, and you can see how it's really bringing out brightness, and it's affecting more because it's only one point. So you could see how you could affect specific colors in your image. Now, one thing you should be aware of is something that's called subtractive primary colors. The additive primary colors are red, green, and blue. The subtractive primary colors are cyan, magenta, and yellow. And the complement to red is cyan. So if you want to add a cyan tint to your image, let's say to the highlights, what you want to do is try to drag this highlights area of the red tone curve to this lower right hand corner. So we're going to bring it down, and we're adding cyan to the highlight. If I want to add red to the highlights, I would drag it to this diagonal corner. So we're dealing with the two diagonal corners that are opposite the actual diagonal line. So if I want to make it red, I'd go this way. So I'm adding red to the highlights, this way cyan to the headlights. And I think this would be more pronounced if I go to the blue channel. The subtractive complement of blue is yellow. And I think what might further illustrate this is if I go to black and white, and I go back to the tone curve, and I'm at the blue part of the tone curve itself, and if I drag it to this corner, I'm going to get that subtractive primary color. So if I pull it down, I'm starting to add yellow. So I'm giving it kind of this yellow tint. Now, if I want to put blue, I would go this way, and I'm starting to give it a blue tint. Now, that's with the highlights, and the more I'm dragging, you can see it's moving everything, though, as I do that, because I'm at the far side. So if you want to just do, like, very specific parts, add a couple control points down. Those kind of lock it down, and then we could go up here, and we could just add yellow to the highlights, or blue to the highlight, whichever you like. So you could see how you could kind of tint your image very specific ways. So just to, get it out and say it, the subtractive complement of red is cyan, the subtractive complement of green is magenta, and the subtractive complement of blue is yellow. So keep that in mind if you find that you need to tint, or you'd like to tint an image. This is more common with black and white photography. Sometimes we like to give it an old look or a cross-process look, and you could do that very easily when you go to the individual channels. So that, like I said, remember that this lower right-hand corner is the subtractive complement of either red, green, or blue, and then the actual red, green, or blue is this top left-hand corner. And that way you could better control the actual colors in your image using the tone curve. Now, I think the last thing I'd like to talk about, we could leave this alone. I'm going to jump to this image, which is, of course, a negative. You could make a positive out of a negative. So those of you that have scanned negatives, you could make a positive, and you do that with the tone curve. And you would do it with the point curve and use the full RGB channels. And what you need to do is just invert the curve, meaning instead of going from the lower left to the upper right, you go from the upper left to the lower right. So you would grab this point and push up, and push it up, 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 until it's in that top right-hand corner. Now we have, of course, a perfectly white image. But then you go to this one, this point on the far left, and pull it down, down, down. And you could see that now we have an exposed, properly exposed, well, a proper image, a positive. Now in this case, this image is a little overexposed, so we'd have to go to the basic panel and probably add some contrast and bring exposure down a little bit. Oh, by the way, these sliders now will work backwards. So you could see that as I move exposure to the right, I'm actually making the image darker. That's because we inverted our tone curve. So, just understand that these tone sliders will work backwards. So we want to bring highlights down, we have to go to the right. And actually shadows will be affecting highlights and highlights will be affecting shadows, and they'll work backwards. So you have to kind of move them around to get the feel of what's going on. And clarity, dehaze, and vibrance and saturation work in pretty much the conventional way. So all the way to the left with saturation, you'll get a black and white image. All the way to the right, you'll get a colorful image. So just understand that the tone sliders will work backwards, and highlights will be shadows, shadows will be highlights, whites will be blacks, and blacks will be whites, and then you could better adjust the negative. Now, quick note, those of you that have purchased the raw files for the series, you will not have this image in the files because it's not mine to give away or mine to sell. So I can't include it in that package. Just go on Google and Google negative, and I think you'll find this image, and then you could practice processing or inverting the tone curve to get a negative, a positive. And I think that's pretty much everything you need to know for the tone curve. It's a very powerful tool, and personally I prefer to use it for contrast over the basic panel. So I will not usually use the basic panel slider for contrast. I prefer to add contrast with the tone curve using this drop down like that. So that's just personal preference. So experiment with the tone curve, and I think you'll find that it's a very useful tool and a very, very powerful tool. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.